I'm James Humphreys. I'm a senior associate in the property litigation team at Burkitt's, and my team's involvement in fire safety issues and specifically the Building Safety Act relates primarily to how it impacts the landlord and tenant relationship. So my part of this webinar relates to existing buildings where fire safety issues have been identified and how the new Act now impacts on how those issues are addressed. So I think from a structural engineering perspective, this is going to feel like perhaps a slightly left field view of the Act, but it's important because it's these provisions relating to landlords and tenants which in my view, underpin how the real estate sector is going to have to respond to what's going on in the Act. So a key part of the Act is that it seeks to protect leaseholders. And the main areas of impact are that the Act imposes new provisions into residential leases. What you can and cannot charge to leaseholders through the service charge now has to be read not just in accordance with the lease, but in terms of what the Act says you can do. And it also has a retrospective effect, which means that it rewrites history in terms of remedial works undertaken and how the cost of those works can be allocated. This is quite clearly going to have huge financial consequences for building owners and landlords who may have legally, even if controversially, recovered costs via the service charge from leaseholders, but now find themselves in a position where those costs may have to be refunded or at least cancelled. The other point to note is that the Act is very long and wide-ranging, as Darren has touched on already, and it was introduced in a bit of a hurry in the end, and that shows in my view. As it's very new, there's no real precedent yet or indication of how it should be interpreted, which means that there are lots of inconsistencies, gaps, and complications which may take some time to be resolved. So before looking at the Act itself, worth again just reminding ourselves how we got here. As we all know, this is a culmination of the increased scrutiny on the safety of high-rise buildings in the UK since the Grenfell Tower fire. And in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell, the focus really was on ACM cladding. And it was quickly established that there are many buildings across the country that have been constructed using that same cladding. Some building owners were quite quick to replace that cladding with a safer alternative and charge the cost to leaseholders via the service charge. And I'm sure that we've all seen the news reports of leaseholders facing financial ruin, having been given service charge demands for those works in the tens of thousands of pounds. And at the time, the government were fairly disapproving of that approach, but essentially permitted it to happen. There was a statement saying that developers, building owners should do the right thing and pay for the remediation costs. And I'm sure that was well intentioned, but there was in practice nothing to prevent them from doing it. And so that's why I've kind of referred to this as the leaseholder pays phase of the government's response. Some building owners, I skipped a key point there. The flip side of that was that some building owners were not so quick to act, which then caused its own issues, because rather than charging leaseholders extortionate service charges, you then had another group of leaseholders who were essentially trapped in their flats, unable to sell or remortgage given the safety issues that had been found. Following on from that, the government then announced tranches of funding to support the costs involved in remediation. So we're moving towards a government pays phase. So we had a round of funding to support the cost of removing ACM cladding, first from social housing blocks, then privately owned buildings. ACM cladding was then discovered to be the tip of the iceberg, and also that the number of buildings affected was far more than anticipated. And that led to the introduction of the Building Safety Fund. So there was firstly a £1 billion fund and then a further £3.5 billion the following year. And that fund remains open in conjunction with the Building Safety Act being introduced. The funding comes with various catches, and has always had various catches, which have applied rather capriciously in some cases. Some buildings were excluded from funding where the building owner had been proactive and already started works. There's been exclusions in terms of who could apply, particularly where developers responsible still own the building, and also exclusions in terms of what it would cover. And one key area here has always been balconies. And it's always been fairly difficult to see the justification for treating balconies differently from cladding, other than perhaps because the funding would otherwise not go far enough. And there are also various administrative difficulties with funding applications, which are taking, as I understand it, a very long time to process. It was these issues that really heralded the beginning of what could be termed the developer pays phase of the government's response. The government first introduced the developer pledge earlier this year, targeted at larger developers and forcing them really to agree to remediate buildings at their own cost or risk having future planning applications refused. And Darren has touched on the fact that this is now enshrined in the Act, but at the time, just stepping back, this was a fairly extraordinary step to have taken. These sort of sanctions could be imposed on developers pretty much as a result of a letter sent by a government minister. But as we've already seen, the developer pledge is now really underpinned in the leaseholder protections contained in the Act. The developer pays phase has almost become anyone but leaseholder pays, as we'll see when looking at the Act in more detail. Essentially, the position now is that leaseholders cannot be asked to pay for cladding remediation and can only be asked to pay for non-cladding remediation in very specific circumstances. And there are various enforcement methods available to make sure that happens in practice. So, turning to the Act itself, and firstly, who qualifies for these protections. The first requirement is that there has to be a relevant building. The building has to be at least 11 metres tall and not 18 metres as per previous funding requirements. The building also has to contain at least 2 flats and has to be privately owned, so not leaseholder owned, rather. There must also be a qualifying lease, essentially a long lease where a premium is paid rather than a rent, and that lease has to contain a service charge. There are also certain ownership requirements. Essentially, anyone that owns more than 3 properties in the UK is going to be excluded from benefiting from these protections. There also has to be a relevant defect, and this is where we really arrive at the meat of this part of the Act and perhaps one of the most contentious areas. The first requirement here is that the defect has to relate to the original construction of the building, and the phrase used is that it has to be something done or not done, or something used or not used in that original construction. It must also cause a building safety risk, either risking spread of fire or the collapse of the building or part of it. Now, this is a pretty wide definition and brings plenty of defects into scope of the Act, which were not previously covered, primarily balconies, which was the example I just gave. It's also wide enough that it's not always going to be straightforward to work out what is and isn't covered. There's going to be scope to argue whether a defect, for example, truly relates to the original construction. I've been advising recently on some timber features on a building, which in principle present a fire risk because it's a combustible material, but which are also rotting and in need of replacement as a point of general maintenance. It's not clear at all whether this should fall within scope of the Act or not, and you can see the scope for dispute in future on this, and the need really for professional and specialist advice on various points around what constitutes a defect and a building safety risk. So, having undertaken the task of working out whether you have a relevant defect or not, the key provisions of the Act are those which say what happens to the cost of remediating those defects. The single, perhaps most significant provision of the Act from a leaseholder perspective is that it is now enshrined that costs connected to cladding defects are never recoverable from leaseholders. And this is pretty much full circle from the government's initial response to the cladding crisis. The cost connected to remediation of non-cladding defects, however, is slightly more nuanced. Those costs are recoverable, but only in very particular circumstances and if certain conditions are met. The conditions essentially create what's been called a waterfall system. And the first condition is that there is a blanket requirement that no cost can be recovered if the landlord is linked to the developer. This ensures that the developer remains primarily liable where still involved with the building. If that condition is not met, then the landlord may be able to recover, but only if their net worth is below a certain threshold, calculated on a per building basis. And that's per building owned by the landlord. The landlord can then still only recover if the lease meets a certain valuation threshold. So that's each flat needs to be worth a certain amount on the open market. Both those conditions clearly require information to be provided by landlord and leaseholder, and there are means within the Act for that sort of information to be provided between landlords and leaseholders. And if the landlord can meet all the conditions, there will be still a cap on the amount that can be charged to leaseholders. That amount varies depending on whether the building is in London or not and the value of the leases, but in most cases it's going to be at £10,000. And that's by no means going to be guaranteed to cover all the costs of remediation. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to just skip through this part, which is about enforcement and ensuring that landlords do stick to what the Act says about remediation and allocation of costs. This will all be available after the webinar. What I really want to just close on and make sure that we have time for some questions is what this really means in practice. I mean, this has only been a very brief run through, but it's clear that the provisions in the Act override the landlord and tenant relationship and fundamentally change the way in which leases drafted years ago now have to be interpreted. And I also mentioned at the start that this is all part of the significantly increased scrutiny on high-rise buildings, and the Act is only going to serve to reinforce that scrutiny. That is going to have a retrospective effect, and landlords and building owners are going to have cause to look back at how buildings have been constructed. And if they now are going to face, as a result, significant costs of remedial works, it's only natural that they're in turn going to scrutinise the professional advice, the construction of the building, and the involvement of contractors and relevant professionals at the time. And coupled with the extended limitation periods that Darren spoke about, that could lead to a raft of new negligence claims against those professionals and contractors. Looking forward, it's clear that landlords and building owners are going to have to continue to monitor the safety of their buildings to a much higher standard than before. And the additional obligations contained in the Act generally create potential liability for landlords, building owners, and managing agents, which at present, and I think on the whole, they're going to be ill-equipped to deal with. And it's only natural that increased exposure and scope for liability is going to need to be filled by professional advice, given the specialist knowledge that's required to assess building safety risks and potential defects. And given the difficulty and shortage of relevant professionals, particularly in fire safety areas, it's going to be really interesting to see how the industry copes with that demand in the coming months and years.